So we just looked at C plus I plus G plus X. We're simply here saying what are they producing? In other words, what's the bread and butter that of this economy? Notice that services, 72% of economic activity in the Netherlands is services. So if you look at GDP consumption by sector, they're definitely a service-based economy. A good portion of industry, 25% of what they produce is industry. So that's, manufacturing and such. But mostly a service-based economy. If we look at the labor force, nearly 8 million people in the labor force, which is the 59th largest labor force in the world. And if you look by occupation, obviously it's not a big surprise that 78.9% or almost 79% of people employed in the Netherlands work in some service-based industry. Another good measure of economic well-being is to investigate both the unemployment rate and the rate of inflation within a country. So the more obvious one to students is the unemployment rate. If you take a nation's labor force, which is simply the number of people who have jobs plus the number of people who are actively looking for jobs, that constitutes your total labor force. So if you take the percentage of people looking for work compared to the labor force, that would give you a nation's unemployment rate. So last year, in 2013, for the Netherlands, the unemployment rate was 8.3%. Now that's rather high considering the United States. Here our unemployment rate has fallen to about 6.2%. So higher unemployment rate in the Netherlands than there is here in the United States. The other thing is you look and say, okay, look at 2012, the unemployment rate was 6.4%, which means there are more people out of work in the Netherlands in 2013 than there were in 2012. And again, that has something to do with the recession that the Netherlands is suffering through. So that's not a good trend there for the Dutch as far as the prospects for good jobs. So they're the 94th lowest as far as unemployment rate. What's interesting though is if you look at the number of people living below the poverty line, less than 10% of people in the Netherlands live below the poverty line, and that's a pretty strong number. All right, and the poverty line is probably measured by something like 20,000 euro or less per year. Now the rate of inflation. What is inflation? On the right-hand side, we see this. It's we all buy goods and services. We buy things like food and clothing, and we buy things like education and entertainment. So if we measure the average price level, in other words, the stuff that we have to buy, how much does the stuff we have to buy change? How much are those prices changing year over year? So in general, economies tend to have some inflation. That is to say, the cost of goods and services goes up. And it typically goes up by a mild amount. So inflation in the Netherlands is about 2.5%, and that's a very manageable level of inflation. So that's definitely not a problem for them. And typically there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Ceteris paribus, them, other things being equal. Well, that's not always the case, but typically when unemployment goes up, there's typically less spending, so the prices of goods and services does not increase at quite the same rate. Okay, let's look at the federal budget for the Netherlands. The Netherlands took in $315 billion in revenue. They spent $339 billion in expenditures, which means that they had a federal budget deficit of nearly $24 billion. Now, obviously, that's not a good thing because if you say, okay, the Netherlands is spending more on government expenditures than they are taking in tax revenues. But the good thing is, if we bump down to the middle of the slide, is that the budget deficit is only a negative 3.3% of GDP. So that's a manageable federal budget deficit. It's not out of control budget deficit. All right. Let's look more closely at taxes and other revenues. The Netherlands tax has a pretty high tax rate if you consider that their taxes represent something like 43.7% of GDP in 2014. That's the 24th best in the world. So what we're saying there is of all the goods and services produced that generates income, about 44% of that income makes its way back to the government in tax revenues. Right? Okay, as far as public debt down there, what does that mean? That means, all right, if we add up all of the deficits run by this country, by the Dutch, by the Netherlands, you come up with their national debt, and it says 74% of the debt is held by the public. So that would be people who live within the Netherlands or they own the debt. Now, what do I mean own the debt? When a country has a federal budget deficit, a country must finance that deficit by issuing bonds, by borrowing money. So that is to say that the government borrows money and they pay back interest. So if we look and say, okay, of all the money that's owed back to the government eventually, 74% of it is held by the public, by people within the country. All right, so the Netherlands had a trade surplus of nearly $66 billion. A trade surplus of nearly $66 billion. Notice when you look at country comparison, it's the 8th best in the world as far as their balance of trade. So exports were pretty strong for the Netherlands. If we just look and say, okay, what do they export? Well, they export commodities of machinery and equipment, chemicals, fuels, foodstuffs. Who do they export to? Germany is one of their big trading partners. Belgium, France, the UK. So obviously countries within the euro, within the European Union, the Netherlands exports a great deal to them. If we look at imports, the one thing that jumps out of this here is that they import some of this very same stuff that they export, but clothing is not on their list of exports, and China is not on their list of export nations. Notice that 12% of what they import comes from China, and obviously they have a trade deficit with that particular country. Okay, central bank discount rate. What does this mean? Well, the EU, the European Union, uses the European Central Bank to set interest rates. The interest rates around the globe, especially in modern westernized economies, have been extremely low. So the EU, the interest rate by the central bank, and the ECB, the central bank, was really low for 2013, less than 1%. More importantly, if we scroll down here to this commercial prime lending rate, that is the money at which banks or lending institutions lend money to the most creditworthy customers. So interest rates in the economy are low, and that should make sense because when an economy is struggling, obviously you want lower interest rates because that will spur borrowing and investment. And finally, the last thing we're going to look at here is the exchange rate between the currency used within the Netherlands, which is the euro, and the US dollar. So this is the exchange rate. We have here the exchange rate from the last 5 years, from 2008 through 2013. Now these are average exchange rates over that year because exchange rates the exchange rate between the dollar and every country's currency changes in almost 24/7, almost around the clock. So these would be the average exchange rates over those years. All right, so why are exchange rates important before we even look at the numbers? Here's why. When the dollar strengthens against another currency, we say that the dollar has appreciated. If the dollar gets weaker against another currency, we say the dollar has depreciated. This is an important concept in economics because appreciating currencies or depreciating currencies have a significant impact on imports and exports, and here's why. So let's assume you're a company within the United States and you export goods and services to Europeans. So your customers live in Europe. If the dollar strengthens against the European currency, it makes American produced goods and services produced here, and export it to Europe more expensive. So if the dollar depreciates, obviously, then it makes U.S. exports to Europe less expensive. And then we're going to talk more about currencies and currency manipulations by some countries later on, but let's take a look at these numbers. So the dollar has been pretty much steadily appreciating against the euro since 2008. And the reason for that primarily is because the U.S. economy has fared better over this time. The European economy has still not got back on track since the Great Recession of 2008 and has had a weaker economic recovery. The final piece to this presentation is to review some current economic events or trends taking place in the Netherlands. I chose the following two economic/current events taking place in the Netherlands. One is the military buildup, and the second one is this idea of the prisoners from Norway. So let's cover these in the order they appear on the PowerPoint slide. Ever since the Ukrainian-Russian conflict and the downing of the Ukrainian plane, the Netherlands has found it beneficial to spend more of their scarce or limited tax revenues on military buildup. Now, obviously, we talked about trade-offs in costs in class. We talked about marginal benefits versus marginal cost. So, obviously, if the government of the Netherlands allocates more funds towards military spending, that's less funds available for items such as education or infrastructure like roads and bridges and such. So there's one aspect of the economic trend taking place. So the government has decided that the marginal benefit of additional military spending outweighs the marginal cost of other services that are necessary. Another interesting economic event or trend taking place in the Netherlands is that the Netherlands has decided to accept a large number of prisoners from Norway. That is to say, people who are already imprisoned in Norway for crimes. They're going to take these prisoners from Norway and house them in prisons within the Netherlands. Now, obviously, there's an overcrowding problem in Norway, right? Now, you ask yourself, why would they do this? Why would the Netherlands agree to take the prisoners from Norway? So, again, cost-benefit analysis. The Netherlands is going to receive payment from the Norwegian government for these prisoners. So, if you think about it, maybe these two particular events are interlinked somehow. Maybe if we think about how is the Netherlands going to finance the additional military spending, well, it could be they could finance some of the additional military spending through the funds they receive from accepting prisoners in Norway. Now, obviously, marginal benefits versus marginal cost. The benefit of accepting these prisoners is the additional the additional revenues that the government will receive from the Norwegian government. So the Netherlands will increase its revenues for funding all kinds of services within the Netherlands. But the issue is, number one, overcrowding in prisons in the Netherlands, and number two, God forbid some of these prisoners escape and some horrific event takes place, the government's going to take some serious criticism for that particular program.